welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica at Syosset Library Turn the Page podcast, and I am thrilled to welcome my guest today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
My pleasure. I'm Gary Zola, and I am a professor at the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. My campus where I teach is the historic Cincinnati campus, which is where the school began in 1875. And on the campus of the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, there is an institution called the American Jewish Archives, which is the largest catalog collection of documentary evidence on the history of American Jewry. And I direct that as well. So I teach and I direct the American Jewish Archives. And I'm so happy to be here with you, Jess.
Thank you so much. How long have you been directing the American Jewish Archives?
Well, I'm just starting now my 22nd year. I began doing that in the year 1998, so 22 years.
Wow, very nice. So today, I know you've written other books and you've done a lot of amazing things, but because this is an episode in honor of President's Week, we invited you here today to discuss your book, which is called...
We called him Rabbi Abraham, Lincoln and American Jewry. And the title came actually, Jess, from a document that I found that, you know, when you're doing primary source research, it's so easy, at least for me, I think for most of us who do this kind of work, you start looking in files and so forth, and it's so easy to get off track because things become so interesting. And when I saw the title, what became the title of my book, when I saw this document, I was reading, I was gathering up eulogies that were written about Lincoln right after his assassination by Jewish leaders. And one of the eulogies I came across had been printed in the Louisville Daily Journal, Louisville, Kentucky. And it appeared really the day after his national funeral. And I was reading that eulogy, which was written by a man by the name of Louis Naphtali Dembitz, who, by the way, was Louis Brandeis's uncle. And when I read these words, I couldn't believe my eyes, because he begins the eulogy. He's talking to the Jews of Louisville. He begins basically by saying, brothers, he says, you know that we used to refer to the late president jocosely, which is a $25 word meaning humorously. He says, we used to refer to the president jocosely as Rabbi Abraham. Well, as a scholar, I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, well, this is contemporary evidence that even before Lincoln's death, Jews of Louisville at least, and I suspect elsewhere, were referring to him as Rabbi Abraham. And that, I realized immediately that sort of was emblematic of the whole purpose of the book, and that's how it became the title.
That's incredible. And from there, the documents and everything just take off. I believe first this is all it's
primary source.
Primary
yes,
sources.
Right.
So these are all primary sources,
right.
Which is, I mean, as a librarian, that is something that makes us really excited, because you can't get much better than that when you're researching. And Lincoln being such a revered historical figure, having primary sources, and then about his relationship with the Jewish people in the country, is, I mean, that's like trifecta perfect.
Well, it really is. It's really interesting. The how I got started on this was, people in my field have known about the fact that Lincoln had a very fascinating and interesting relationship with the American Jewish community, and because I was the director of the American Jewish Archives, I was asked to serve on the academic advisory council of the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, which was a national commission that was created to help the country celebrate Lincoln's 200th birthday in the year 2009. And what happened was, I wasn't planning on writing a book about Lincoln and the Jews. I basically thought, well, work has been done and people sort of know about that. But when I began to teach about it, I began to prepare, and I started to find some interesting things that I felt hadn't really been fully explored, and that's what got me going on the book. And what that really means, Jess, is that although the book, as you know, does talk about Lincoln before he becomes president and during his administration and the Jewish people, half of the book is devoted to the idea of Lincoln and how Lincoln as a concept and who he was and memory, and what how Jews have treasured his memory from the time of his death to the present day. In fact, I end the book talking about the film that was made by Steven Spielberg in 2013, Lincoln, which I kind of describe why, of all people who would want to do a film on Lincoln, why it would be Spielberg, and why the man he chose to write the script, movie script, would be the playwright Tony Kushner. So that's how I end the book. And so it's the other thing I'll mention that might be of interest to those who are listening is the publishers deserve all the credit for the way the book came out, because when I first submitted it to them, my idea was merely to write the narrative, like a traditional history, and put all the documents in footnotes. They were the ones who said, why don't you introduce each chapter with 5, 10, whatever it is, 15 pages of explanation, and then let the people read the documents themselves. So this is what you would call a documentary history. It gives you not only the story, but an opportunity to read some of the documents that helped me to write the book.
So in the book, you discuss, there's many different relationships that you explore. One which prominently comes up, Lincoln's relationship with Zachary, is it? Am I pronouncing it incorrectly?
Yes,
correctly?
Right, Dr. Zachary. Issachar Zachary. By the way, there's a new book coming out on that man. A professor, retired MD from Ohio, just sent me a manuscript and is going to come out not too. He's an interesting character, this guy. So let me tell the listeners, believe it or not, Abraham Lincoln had a podiatrist or a chiropodist, a foot doctor. And, this man was a very proud and self-identifying Jewish man who had come to America from England. And what the audience might be thinking right off the top of their head is that Zachary was sort of just trimming Lincoln's toenails. But he was doing a lot more than that.
I have to say, so one thing that came up when I was reading about it, and also you have you do have a lecture from, is it the American Jewish Archives? Yeah, there's on YouTube. There's also a lecture which is amazing and very funny. So I urge our listeners to watch it because it's great. But one thing that came to mind is, Lincoln being a very tall man, and you can make a joke that he had very big shoes to fill, but in many different ways, because he is, again, as I said, he's really so lauded by the country and always looked at as this, almost like a figurehead of morality and doing what's right. So, this guy knew exactly what shoes anybody who would follow him would have to fill.
Well, I'll tell you why this man. It's wonderful that you selected Zachary to focus on, because in a way it's easy to dismiss him as a foot doctor or a toenail clipper.
And I have to say another thing, and we'll talk more about their relationship, that really warmed my heart was, when you say you're only as good as how you treat, I guess, the people who are serving you. That's kind of a saying, like if you see somebody in a restaurant, no matter how they're treating their friends, how they treat the serving staff and the service industry is, really a good indication of their character. The fact that he had a relationship with a gentleman who literally was treating his feet, that just is such a credit to the character of Abraham Lincoln, who was president.
Yeah, well, he's a fascinating figure, and I had the privilege, as I say, of reading this manuscript, and so this, if anyone listening is fascinated by Zachary, now Zachary himself is going to have a much larger treatment, but he comes to America, and it's very possible he taught himself. He claims he studied with some of the finest foot doctors in Europe. Who knows? He may have taught himself, but the truth is, it seems almost beyond question that he was very effective. And he starts by, he's a self-promoter, which is why a lot of people during his day and even afterwards historically question his motives, because without a doubt he was a promoter. He had the idea that what's going to make him one cut above anybody else is he's got to get his name out there, and he's got to find a way to promote his profession. So he gets himself involved in treating the feet of the Union soldiers, and when he succeeds, he now talks his way into treating generals. He treats McClellan's feet. And from these soldiers, he gets himself into the cabinet, because I guess, I'm assuming that in those days, there weren't all, good feet products and all of that. And so, there was a lot of foot pain. We know Lincoln himself suffered from that. So he ends up getting introduced eventually to Lincoln. And he becomes a regular at the White House. Now, the interesting thing, and you make this point yourself, is Lincoln is known to be an extremely good judge of character. And Lincoln definitely likes this man. And the interesting, and I'll just say this and leave it to the audience if they're interested, this man who was treating his feet, when they must have been, just like a barber or like a hair beautician, you talk to these people, while you're sitting there, and you communicate, right? So during one of these sessions, maybe Lincoln was talking about the problems that he was having with New Orleans, because, the Union conquers New Orleans very early in the war, and that becomes pivotal to the ultimate victory of the Union. But there's a lot of unhappiness in the Union, in New Orleans. There's a lot of loyalty to the Confederacy, and they feel they're behaving as though they're living under duress and so forth. And there was a very mean, rigid governor by the name of Butler, General Butler, who treated people with an iron fist. And Lincoln wanted to win over the people, make them warmer to the Union and to bring them back to the Union. So he must have been talking about this topic with Zachary, and this is what Zachary must have told him. Zachary must have said, there are a number of prominent Jewish citizens in New Orleans, and I know them. And if you send me down to New Orleans and let me work with your new general in charge, a man by the name of Nathaniel Banks, who replaced this mean, harsh general by the name of Butler, I can encourage these Jewish leaders to join with us in support of the Union, and they will have an effect on the whole community because many of them are prominent and leaders of the community. Well, Lincoln sends him down. And then the other interesting thing that comes of this, he's so successful. We have all these documents, Jess. This is not make-believe. In other words, we actually have...
The facts are in.
Yeah, we have letters from Zachary, who writes from New Orleans. He's writing to Seward. He writes to Lincoln. General Banks writes about the effect that he's had.
So these are referenced, cross-referenced.
Yes.
Hard facts.
Yes. And then eventually, after 3 or 4 months, they're so successful. He's so successful in his new role down as like a special envoy that he says to Lincoln, he writes, and to Seward, he says to them, look, somebody down here told me that they could introduce me to Judah P. Benjamin. Who's Judah P. Benjamin? Judah P. Benjamin was known as the brains of the South. He was a Jewish man who had 3 positions on the Confederate cabinet. He was Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and Attorney General, different times. And he says, I could meet with this man and we can try to negotiate an end to this war. And one of the documents that's in this book, Jess, it's probably the only such document, we have known for all these years that Zachary said he could do that because we had the letters where he says he could arrange to meet for him, but we've never had the proof that these 2 men met. And with just dumb luck at the Library of Congress, I found a letter that Zachary writes to Judah P. Benjamin the day after they met.
Wow.
Yeah. So that confirms that they actually met. And we know that from that letter that the 2 discussed negotiating an end to the war. We also know, and have known for many years, that when that idea is brought to Lincoln, even though Lincoln periodically discusses the idea of negotiating an end to the war, Lincoln never goes down that road. He always he always chooses unconditional surrender. And but Zachary brings him this possibility. He says they're open to negotiating an end to the war. And then Lincoln says, thank you, but no thank you. And this ticks off Zachary, who feels he's done a lot of work for no reason at all. But they end up being friends again. And then in 1864, Zachary emerges again and says, I'm going to see to it that the Jews vote for you to be reelected. That causes a whole, discussed that too, that causes a whole to-do in 1864 because a lot of the Jewish people said, don't listen to him. Jews don't vote as a bloc for anybody. We vote as Americans. They don't want to be known as supporting anybody. But Zachary says he's going to get Jews to support the president.
That's very interesting, and you touched on something that I wanted to bring up. So, Jewish Confederates. There was a population, big population of Jewish Confederates.
Right. Well, Jews, when they come to this country, they come during the colonial period. In fact, the first Jewish community is established in the year 1654. It's a long time before the country comes into existence. And by the time the revolution comes about, there's 5 communities with congregations and organized Jewish life. 3 in the north, 2 in the south, Savannah and Charleston. And by the time the Constitution is adopted in 1786, there's now 6. The 6th was Richmond, Virginia. So you end up with 3 in the north and 3 in the south. So from the beginning, my point is, you had Jews living in the southern states. And those Jews in the southern states, just like the Jews in the northern states, they adapt themselves very readily to the culture in which they find themselves in. Because Jews were accepted and treated as more or less as equals, socially and politically, they become loyal citizens of their region. And what that means is that in the South, Jews in the South owned slaves in the same exact number as the general population. Perhaps in some cases a bit less, but they're fundamentally, there's no evidence that the Jews in the South took on any different point of view morally than the other white people. This is often very hard for Jews today to cope with, because we like to think of ourselves and as Jews as, after all, one of the main stories in our heritage is that we were slaves in Egypt. How could we honor, for God's sakes, how could we support slavery? I think this is a very difficult question to answer. I don't have any facile answers for you except to say that it shows you the power of acceptance, that when people feel accepted and loved and embraced, they want to be a part of their neighbors. And that's for the good, but it can also be sad when we realize what a terrible decision that was at that time.
Yeah.
It's a lesson for our own day, isn't it? In
Absolutely.
other words, we're all in the future. Those of us who live today, the future, this is without question, this is a fact, this is just not an opinion. The future citizens of this country will assess us today.
Absolutely.
They'll look at primary sources from today.
Yep.
So that should sober us all up.
Yep. Absolutely. I agree. And it's very interesting because, again, it's as you said, I don't think I think that is kind of I don't want to say bitter pill to swallow that there were slave owners, Jewish slave owners, but it's, I think sometimes looking back and sort of, I don't want to say accepting is like a good way to move forward and sort of assess, okay, where do you go from here? But
well, here's another way of putting it. I think I try to rephrase what you said this way, that you have to face your history.
That's right. A much better way of saying what I was hoping to say.
Right. That we can't go forward if we don't understand our past, and you can't have a make-believe past. You have to face the facts, and those are the facts. And the facts are that Jews fought for the Confederacy, and Jews died for the Confederacy, and Jews spoke out in defense of human slavery, and that's a tragedy from which we need to face up to it and acknowledge it, and think about it. There's only one Jew in all of American history whose face appeared on currency, and that Jew is Judah P. Benjamin, who was on the $2 bill for the Confederates. So Jews had a prominent place in the South, and that's a legacy that I'd like to think that this is a personal opinion, not everyone would agree with this, but I'd like to think that the oversized role that Jews played in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s with Dr. King in some way is a way of reckoning and addressing the fact that the Jews in the South were defenders of a position that I think we all, every human being of decent fiber will recognize, that to argue that a person of color should become the property of people of a different skin color is just morally repugnant. Yeah,
absolutely. So I wanted to ask you discuss in your book about a photograph that President Lincoln sat for with a gentleman named Samuel Altshuler.
Right. This is a great story. One of the I try to devote some attention to the idea that Lincoln grew up in a part of the country, we call it today the Midwest. It was called the Old Northwest in Lincoln's day. And that was a part of the country that grows from being really an empty prairie to a quarter of all of the United States population lives in that part of the world when Lincoln is getting ready to wants to become president. So who are all these people who filled up this empty territory? These people are immigrants, most of which, not all of which, but most of which come from Central Europe, lots of the German states and the Baltic states and so forth. And therefore, and this has been pointed out before, Lincoln, in order to become who he is, Lincoln is used to hearing foreign accents. He's used to dealing with people who weren't born in this country, in contrast to him. And he couldn't possibly hope to be elected if he was going to be anti-immigrant. Because by the time he's ready to run for president, about 75 to 80% of the people who are voting are all immigrants. And he must have heard a lot of German accents and so forth. And the fact that there's so much evidence that he learned how to deal with these people is very much a part of his mystique. And there's the story that you bring up is a wonderful story where I think it really helps people to understand who Lincoln was as just a human being. So the story goes that he was in Urbana to do some court work on the circuit, and this was at 1857 in the spring, and he happened to be known to be hoping to become senator, right? He's running against Douglas, and he wants to become the United States senator from Illinois. So he's already a pretty prominent local figure, and he gets to Urbana in Illinois, and this immigrant by the name of Samuel Altschuler, who was born in Bavaria and comes to the United States, and decides to set himself up as a photographer. You know, today we think of photographers as being, they're trained, they study, they go to fine art schools, they get degrees. You know, they're very practiced professionals. I'm highly doubt that was the case with Mr. Altschuler. Altschuler approaches Lincoln on the streets and says, "I'm wondering if I could take a picture of Mr. Lincoln." And what Altschuler had in mind was if he could take a picture of this famous politician, put it in his window, it would be good for business.
Of course.
Right.
Right.
Well, now Lincoln doesn't know this man. He's never met this man before. So I think, think about politicians today. If you walked up to anybody, I'm not talking about a national figure, a local politician, say, will you come to my store? So it's hard to imagine anybody doing that. Apparently Lincoln says yes, and after he finishes at the court, he brings over with him another lawyer, and they talk on the way over to Altschuler. And this is important because later in life, the lawyer who was with him, he writes down what happened, and that's how we know. So, at least we know some of the details from this. And apparently they get to the photography store, and Mr. Altschuler is a little disappointed because Lincoln, instead of wearing his famous top coat, black top coat and something, Lincoln is apparently wearing a white sort of smocky kind of
not classic Lincoln at all.
Not
classic
right.
Lincoln.
And it's not going to be good for a black and white picture. So Altschuler suggests maybe he would go back to the hotel and change his coat, which already is what you might call chutzpah. And Lincoln says, "Well, I don't have anything else with me." So not to ever, he's a clever businessman. So Altschuler says, "Well, how about would you wear my coat? I have a dark coat." So Lincoln says, "Okay, fine." And then, of course, what we now know is that neither of these two gentlemen stopped to think that Abraham Lincoln was 6'4", and Altschuler apparently was 5'4". And so when they puts on Altschuler's jacket, the length of the sleeve, and Lincoln's arms were particularly long.
Yes.
The end of the sleeves just go down to his elbows. And apparently this strikes Lincoln as hilarious. And so he cannot stop laughing. And this is reported by the other lawyer. And every time Altshuler gets under the curtain, Lincoln starts to laugh. And according to the lawyer who was there, he says, Lincoln says to Altshuler, tell me a joke. If you tell me a joke, I'll get it out of my system. So Altshuler's trying to make the future president laugh. And, finally, after maybe a long period, who knows, maybe 45 minutes or whatever, of all this silliness, he gets under the curtain and he's able to snap a picture of Lincoln and that picture has survived. It's a famous picture, and you can see it's a tight headshot so that you don't see the arbs. And if you look on Lincoln's lips, it's clear from the picture that Lincoln is kind of pursing his lips. He's holding them together tightly so that he doesn't burst out into laughter. But the main point of this that I make out of it is it's not just a silly story, although it is humorous. It's also indicative of the kind of man Lincoln was. He was willing to let a complete stranger, who was a foreigner and a Jew to be on top of it, to take his picture. He owed this man nothing.
Yeah.
And had nothing to gain. But he was a good guy.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's something else, two things that struck me about that story. So first of all, Lincoln, if I remember correctly, is the first president to be photographed. Is that correct, or am I incorrect?
No, I don't think that's correct. There were photographs of Buchanan and others, but
I stand corrected. Then.
I think, I think it would probably be correct to say that among the things that Lincoln did that were outstanding is Lincoln definitely makes use of photographs in a much larger way. The amount of photos
that must be what
Lincoln is also given credit for using. There's a whole book on this. Using the telegraph in a way that had never been done before by a president.
So that's interesting. So I guess this is I guess apocryphal then that he was the first president that was photographed, because clearly there's evidence that he wasn't.
Definitely. But I think you're probably thinking he was
made use
of it politically,
yes.
and the amount of photography of Lincoln. The number of photos we have of him is, without question, I can't think of anybody before him off the top of my head who even comes close to him. He regularly sat for photos. We have photos with his family. We have photos of him in a whole variety of ways. And of course, the Civil War, you have a number of prominent photographers who really begin to document photographically the war.
So really, he was there when the wave.
Yes.
He really took that wave on and wrote it and used it.
Right. I'll tell you what a comparable idea would be. You wouldn't say that John Kennedy was the first a president ever to be on television. On the other hand, his debate with Nixon catapults that role into an entirely different category. I would compare it.
I think that's a really good analogy. So aside from that, and that's all very good information. The other thing, though, that struck me about the story is that it depicts, Lincoln is very he's laughing and he seems very jovial, and there's so many stories about how he could be prone to depression.
Yes.
I know there's letters when he was courting Mary Todd. Her family didn't think that he was good enough for her. Right. And there's all of these solemn, the Todds, nobody's good enough for them. And it's great, so all of this, he is willing to sit for this gentleman who just walked up to him on the street, a foreigner, a Jew, and then this man, he borrows this man's coat and he's laughing, and it's a goofy side of Lincoln. Just everything about the story is just a really different picture of Abraham Lincoln than we're presented with.
You're making a great point, and it actually is connected to the whole topic of the photography, because why was it primarily that in the 19th century nobody smiled in photographs? Sometimes people jump to the conclusion, well, that was just stylistic, and that in the 20th century we learned how to smile and it became customary. It has nothing to do with that. Because of the primitive nature of photography, you had to be very still for a long period of time while the picture was being taken, maybe 2 seconds or whatever it was. So smiling was going to just blur the picture. So you were told. There even were neck braces that they gave to people to wear so that you wouldn't move your chin or what have you. So all those pictures that we have of Lincoln, and we have quite a number, they are almost all, there's none with a great big smile, and they're almost all somber. And if you read the books that get into Lincoln as personality, especially, let's say, someone like Doris Kearns Goodwin's, Team of Rivals, she goes into this. She says that people who knew Lincoln would say that when Lincoln began to laugh, his whole disposition changed, and that his whole expression and was so delightful, and people were drawn to him from his laughter. And it's hard for us to imagine Lincoln laughing.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. He really is a lot of times just kind of, thought of a very tall, solemn. You hear more about the, prone to melancholy than prone to laughter. And that's really just an amazing in general, and part of what I loved about that story. So there's so many topics that we can discuss from your book, and just in general about Lincoln's, why they called him Rabbi Abraham, and the relationship, his relationship with the American Jewish people. But I wanted to just sort of come to the issue that came up about chaplainship in the Army, Jewish chaplainship. Would you like to discuss that?
Yeah, and then I'll sort of tie it to the bigger picture of the book, which maybe will interest people. What I in a nutshell, what the book tries to do is show first why it was that it's really an accurate statement to say that why it is that Abraham Lincoln knew more Jews prior to coming into office than all 15 presidents who preceded him collectively. There are several reasons. I won't go into it, but I try to begin by explaining that.
And they often there were, was it the eulogies where they discussed that they considered him
almost what you might call an almost chosen person.
Right.
Right. And but that happens, that feeling happens because Lincoln, as president, he doesn't just know Jews, though he knows a lot of Jews, and he has just associations. He buys clothing from Jews. He's encountered Jews. They're not strange and exotic to him. They're people he lived with. Second, I demonstrate that he, in fact, had some very close Jewish friends and political allies. So all of this sets the stage for the presidency. As president, certain things begin to happen that could have been very problematic for the American Jewish community, and Lincoln, I'd like to think because of the nature of who he was, and also because these were not strangers to him. They were his fellow neighbors and citizens. He acts in a way which I think we would all agree, in retrospect, was very noble. And the third part of the book, which is a good chunk of it, is, like you pointed out, what it is that happens as a result of his presidency, the feelings that he engenders in memory, and how Lincoln becomes sort of an almost chosen person. He becomes, well, the way I put it in the book is that from the time of his death until the present time, Jews in America love to Judaize Lincoln, and in that process, Lincoln Americanizes the Jews, because it's a fact that among the most ardent proponents of memorializing Lincoln, meaning remembering Lincoln and creating this image of him, which we take for granted, Jews have played an outsized role in that process. In fact, the cover of the book, which you're able to see,
it will be also on our website when this episode goes up. So if you did not encounter this episode from going to the Turn the Page website, if you got it on like a podcatcher, go to the Turn the Page website or just look it up. It is available everywhere, and it's awesome.
So the cover of the book is, as everybody knows, is the image that is on the penny. And I go into the book in a whole chapter. I focus on the fact that the man who actually is the numismatic, who designs this penny and this famous image that we take for granted, that's been on a coin longer than any image in all of American history, the Lincoln penny, was a Jewish immigrant who, thanks to Theodore Roosevelt, is given the opportunity to design that image. He shows his drawing to President Roosevelt, who was a big admirer of Theodore Roosevelt, of Abraham Lincoln, and that image is chosen. So, in other words, why in 1909, when the penny comes into existence to honor the 100th birthday of Abraham Lincoln, of all people to draw this iconic image, a Jewish immigrant from Eastern Europe is the man who becomes that figure. The story you wanted me to tell is one of the what I call three big events that occur during Lincoln's presidency that become sort of iconic thoughts about Abraham Lincoln, that transform him not just into an American hero. He is an American hero. They transform Lincoln into an American Jewish hero. And one of those, and the big that you ask about, is the fact that when the war breaks out and the Union starts to recruit and enlist soldiers, laws are passed in the summer of '61 by Congress to make it possible to develop an army. And in those laws, passed in June or July of '61, it says without question that chaplains may be appointed by brigadier generals. But it says also quite clearly that those chaplains must be bona fide chaplains of or representatives of the Christian religion. And without retelling every detail, this becomes very upsetting to the Jewish community. Many Jews had already enlisted in the army, and the idea that they were fighting for the Union in significant numbers, and they had no religious leaders in the military to take care of them was distressing. And so a Jewish community decides they're going to appeal to Lincoln. I'm going to cut the story as short as I can. They send a representative to Washington to meet with Lincoln, and this representative appeals to the president and asks the president to appoint Jewish chaplains. Initially, Lincoln tells him, "Let me think this over." And then he tells this representative that he has thought it through and that he is not going to just appoint someone, or he's not going to use executive privilege. He wants to have the whole law changed. And there was some concern, I'm sure, at that moment that that's the long and hard road, and the war probably could be over
by the time legislation gets changed.
But as you saw in the book, Lincoln, and we have documentary evidence, Lincoln not only pushes this, he actively promotes it. He twists arms. He calls people, and I point out that not everybody in his cabinet thought this was worthy of such attention. It was sort of like, what are you worried about, this teeny little minority? And Lincoln works on it, and within 5 months, the law is passed. And in a way, Lincoln was right, because instead of just by fiat, he actually gets the national legislature, the houses of Congress, to change the law. And then it's Lincoln who has the privilege of being the first president in the history of this nation to appoint a Jew to serve as a military chaplain.
That's incredible. And that chaplain's gentleman's name?
Was Frankel. Benjamin, he was a religious leader from Philadelphia, Benjamin Frankel. I always have to say it carefully because I always want to say Benjamin Franklin.
But it's not.
Frankel,
clearly a different historical
figure. Frankel.
Thank you so much for sitting with us.
Oh, it's great. I'm happy to do it.
Absolutely honored. It really is. It really is a picture of a president who really wanted the best for not just the majority. He wanted the best for people who were in a minority. He really wanted to speak up for, those who might not have the most populous influence, but he knew he seemed like his moral character, the fiber of being that he was really a testament to how we remember him and how the American Jewish community began to speak of him as Rabbi Abraham.
You're so right, and it's a great point, and very perceptive. And in fact, Jess, the truth is we have a document that I mention in the book that really confirms that. You may remember reading that after a visit that he has with the famous Rabbi Isaac Wise, Wise goes to Washington and meets with Lincoln. Wise comes back, and in his newspaper he reports on his discussions with, this would be in early 1863, and there he thanks the president for what the president has done for the Jews, and he says exactly what you just said. He says, Lincoln told me, this is what Wise reports, he says, Lincoln told me that he's always felt that it was wrong for people to besmirch an entire group just because of the wrongdoing of one person. And so this reinforces what you were just saying, that Lincoln, by nature, was not inclined to stereotype people. That was his personality. He was inclined to give all people a fair crack. And there's a lot of evidence that goes beyond the Jewish community that would reinforce that. And if your listeners want to see some of these documents, they can visit the American Jewish Archives. And I know the book is here at the Syosset Library.
And in libraries everywhere.
Right.
And bookstores. It is readily available.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
It was a pleasure to have you. So once again, this is Jessica, and I am here with...
This is Gary Zola, and we're talking about We Called Him Rabbi Abraham, Lincoln and American Jewry.
Thank you so much, and we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.